everybody, and welcome back to the House of Nostalgia. If this is your first time here, welcome. Today's video is about the interesting life and music of Mr. Gil Scott Heron. He was recently inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was a poet, musician, author, and scholar. Music critic Nelson George described him as a teller of uncomfortable truths. The obstacles that he endured in his childhood while growing up in the 50s was put into his music, along with his political views as a grown man that seemed to make him a bit controversial in the entertainment industry. One thing about him that couldn't be denied was his intelligence and his talent, which a lot of people labeled him as a genius. The Revolution Would Not Be Televised was an explosive start to a musical and writing career that lasted for decades. His poetry and spoken word performances has been credited by some of the most lyrical rappers and neo-soul artists of our time. He was partially raised by his grandmother in the South in his most crucial years, and this is where he got his first-hand learning of racism, death, and disappointments that this world has to offer us all. Now, since he was around for a while, as I got older, I noticed how tall and handsome he was, and I started hearing about the ups and downs that his life and career took. I will also be reviewing his first 10 albums of his career. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share the video. Gil Scott Heron was born April the 1st, 1949 to Bobby Scott and Gilbert St. Elmo Heron. He was born in Chicago, Illinois, in Providence Hospital. Now, some interesting history about Providence Hospital is that it was opened in 1891, and it was the first Black-owned and operated hospital in the United States. The hospital got its start from Dr. Emma Reynolds, who was denied entry into the only 2 nursing schools in Chicago because she was Black. So she opened a nursing school to train Black women to become nurses, and then hired Black doctors who were not able to work as doctors. So it's a lot of history behind this hospital. Gil Scott Heron's mother was an opera singer and librarian. His father was a Jamaican-born soccer player who was the first Black person to play for the Celtics football team in Glasgow, Scotland in the 50s. So his parents seemed to break up when he was a child. His mother fell on hard times, so she decided to send him to live with her mother in Jackson, Tennessee until she got herself together. Now, his grandmother, Lily Hamilton, on the other hand, was doing pretty good. She was living in a working class neighborhood, and this is when Gil started learning a lot about Black history. And his grandmother was a big influence on him learning about the Black civil rights leaders and lawyers of the early 1950s, and what he learned for himself living in Jackson, Tennessee. For instance, he wanted to go to Tigard Junior High School, and it was still segregated, but it was all overturned in January of 1962. So his mother enrolled him, and it wasn't easy for him being there, and he wasn't there long, but he was a part of history by being among a small group of Black kids that went to that school. So all of what he went through was in his music, and this is what made him sort of controversial in the early part of the 70s. It wasn't about dancing, it was about the lyrics. His grandmother passed away in 1961, and his mother was there for him during this time, but they left to live in the Bronx, New York. And a matter of fact, everybody that lived in his grandma's neighborhood have to leave because a highway was built through that neighborhood. His mother experienced hard times again, so Gil took a job while still underage, washing dishes at a local steakhouse to help. He went to DeWitt Clinton High School and got the attention of one of his teachers, Nettie Leaf, who saw talent in his writings. She helped him get into the prestigious Filston private school, where he was one of the 5 black students attending the school, which put him in an environment where it was more like the have and the have-nots, so to speak, with him being one of the have-nots. And he also felt alienated at that school, but he did graduate. He attended Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, where he met Brian Robert Jackson, and he was very influential in the first 10 years of Gil's career. They collaborated on songs together up until 1980, and this consisted of them performing, writing, and producing these albums together. He formed his first band with Brian called Black and Blue, and around this time he dropped out of school and became an author, writing 2 books, Vulture and The End Factory. In 1970, Heron recorded his first album, and it was recorded live in a New York City nightclub, and the album is titled Small Talk at 125th and Lenox. Now, while listening to this first single on this album, The Revolution Would Not Be Televised, I immediately closed my eyes because it took me back to the 70s. It was just like watching a blaxploitation movie. Now, the songs on the album are recorded with a Congo drum as the instrument, but the version of this song that I heard was remade on his second album, Pieces of a Man, and that version had the spoken word plus flute and drum sounds. Now, he was a very intelligent man. He received his master's at St. John Hopkins University and started teaching literature and creative writing for many years as a full-time lecturer at the University of the District of Columbia. And he did this while still recording and performing his music. Now, another thing that comes to my mind when listening to that song was the influence that he had on other songs. And one in particular was the 1977 song Let's Clean Up the Ghetto by the Philadelphia International All-Stars. Now, this song was similar to me, but different, if you know what I mean. Lou Rawls started off this song with spoken word, so right away you hear it. And that song also featured Teddy Pendergrass, Billy Paul, Archie Bell, Eddie Levert, and Walter Williams of the OJs. Now, if you ever get a chance, check it out. When this song come out, Gil was on his 7th album. His second album, Pieces of a Man, was released in 1971 with much anticipation. And the first single on this album was the remake of The Revolution Would Not Be Televised, with Hubert Laws playing the flute and saxophone all throughout this album. Now, this album was a little bit more commercialized than his first album, and that's mainly because the first album was recorded using only a Congo, and this album had a band. If his first album sound reminds you of a blaxploitation movie, the sound of this album had a more open range. You start to hear the jazz part of his music that I wouldn't have noticed in the first album. And the song Save the Children is a song you would hear in any early 70s movie that you might catch on a late night. And Lady Day and Coltrane is the hit for me on this album. I heard the title track for his 1972 album Free Will later in life, and I was surprised because I had forgot about it. And you know how we act when we hear a song that we forget about. Get Out the Ghetto Blues song is just that. It's a blues song, and a good one. So now we know that he's able to make blues. Gil Scott Heron was an artist that painted a clear picture with his music. I sat still and listened to this whole album, and that's something that I rarely do unless I'm in my car. Now you start to hear a slight change in his music with his 1974 album Winter in America. And this is his 4th album. And another thing I noticed is that Brian Jackson's name started to appear on the front of his albums up until 1980's Real Eyes. Rivers of My Father is a beautiful song, and I also liked Back Home. And this is the album that had the single The Bottle, which had good radio play. and it was the first 12-inch single ever. After this album, he signed with Clive Davis, and he was the first artist on the Arista label, and he stayed with this label until 1982. So this was his second time making history. The first minute of A New Day was released in 1975, and it was very interesting, and I will admit it went over my head a bit. This is the first album that featured other writers besides Gill and Johnson. Now we're already moving into 1976, and this is Heron's sixth album from South Africa to South Carolina, and he is very vocal on his stance on political issues. Now the first track off of this album is Johannesburg, which was about apartheid in South Africa, and this song was a hit. He performed it on Saturday Night Live.
Brothers and sisters in South Africa called Johannesburg, and when we say, what's the word, we'd like to have y'all help us out saying Johannesburg. Let's go. Help!
Another thing is that his songs were remastered and re-released years later, and they charted again. The 1976 title track, It's Your World, is a dance song, but it's like a celebration dance song, and he shows no signs of slowing down. Actually, this album is where your music should be 6 years after your debut album. You cannot listen to this music and not feel excitement, and it still sounds fresh and new. It actually makes you feel good. Well, it made me feel good to know that I listened to all of these songs before I started this video, because the message is the same, and with his music by now you expect that, but you also hear change at the same time. For nostalgic music lovers, this album, It's Your World, is more like a piece of art. Vitgolia, Deaf, Dumb, and Blind, and We Almost Lost Detroit were two of my favorites on his 1977 Bridges album. Now, I remember Angel Dust on his 1978 Secrets album, and it was a hit. And I was surprised that this song only made it to number 15 on the charts. He married actress Brenda Sykes in 1978. She was in My Black Actresses from the 70s video, and they have a daughter. Now, he is the father of 4 children. His next album was recorded in 1979, so I understand why he named it 1980. His music was entering into a whole nother decade, and you can start to hear that 80s sound in his music, which lets you know that he was able to change his music with the times, but still stay true to himself. Now, the first thing I noticed about the song Alien, Hold On to Your Dreams, was the change in his voice. Now, I don't know if it was from 10 years of singing or just getting older. The song Willing assures you that musically he would slide through the 80s with no problem with the same voice that I heard from the start. Now, every song on this album that I hear, I say it's my favorite until I hear the next. I really did enjoy this album. Now, I just reviewed his first 10 albums, and he recorded 18. 2 of them was released after his death. Heron recorded 9 live albums, 12 composition albums, 1 film score, and 1 soundtrack, and he wrote 6 books. And this is his life's work, and he passed away at the early age of 62. He stayed true to himself throughout the rest of his career, but he had a couple of albums, 1981 Reflections and 1982 Moving Target, that he experimented with a reggae sound. So even though he did no pop music that I heard, he did blues, soul, R&B, jazz, spoken word, and reggae. And one good thing is that he slid right past the disco craze and never fooled with that at all. And another thing I found interesting is that on his 2010 I'm New Here album, he used the Kanye West loop, and his music seemed to be a little bit more mellowed out a bit. And I feel it had a lot to do with things that was going on with his life in the early 2000s. He did a 3.5 prison stint on 2 separate drug incidents, and he suffered with some health issues as well. And I read up on Gil a couple of years ago, so I wasn't surprised by any of this. And I don't know what drove him to that, but his music was to influence people and wake them up, get involved. And I can only imagine the pressure that record companies may have put on him about being more commercial. It's all about money, money, money. And he most definitely was a lyrical and musical genius. He really was. I mean, who wouldn't have wanted to sit in a recording studio with him and watch him work? Especially if you was a recording artist or a writer. He had a huge influence on the R&B and rap community and the neo-soul music as well, because of his life's work. And I believe he is in a class all by himself in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because of the music that he made. Gil Scott Heron passed away May the 27th, 2011 in New York City at the age of 62. He left all this beautiful music for all of us to reminisce on for years to come. And I want to wish you all a happy new year, you guys. It's 2022. And I thank you all for watching all of my videos and subscribing to my channel. And I want you to know that I really appreciate it. And I thank you all so much.